right, welcome, folks. I'm Rob Breakenridge for nationalpost.com and NP Comment. Our guest this week is at the center of a really interesting shift in BC politics in a campaign that's attracting a lot of national interest. Caroline Elliot is running to be the next Premier of BC, but of course, up first is the BC Conservative Party leadership race. Caroline Elliot, great to have you with us here this week.
Thanks for having me.
So first of all, what should folks know about you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, look, just stepping back a little bit and looking at BC as a whole, I think we're at just a critical juncture. We've had 8.5 years of rule under the NDP, first by John Horgan, which I think people don't get too upset about, but second by David Eby, where we've seen a radical shift, and I do mean emphasis on the word radical, very ideological shift in terms of where BC's been going, the decisions that have been made, and it's left us in a situation where we're seeing economic issues. We're seeing massive fiscal mismanagement. We're seeing, basic programs like healthcare and education not doing what they need to be doing for people. So into that fray, I've decided to step. And the thing that I would say about me is, I've been speaking up on a lot of issues in BC for a long time. And I'm happy to go into any of those specific issues as part of this conversation. But when the moment came where I could actually choose to step into it and kind of try to make some of the changes that I think are necessary, I've decided to take it.
Yeah, the upheaval in BC politics over the last couple of years has been really interesting. And I know you've worked in the past with BC United, the BC Liberals, but, as we saw that shift where essentially, an entirely new right of center party emerged and very quickly almost formed government, in the BC election in 2024, the NDP just barely eked out a majority. Talk about that seismic shift and how things got to that point.
Yeah, BC is, I think, a little bit famous for having never a dull moment when it comes to politics. And certainly the last year or two has been very much the case. Yes, I've been part of the BC Liberals, BC United for a lot of my political career. It was the only party on the center right, I guess you would call it, in BC. I was sort of you're either with the NDP or you're with the BC Liberals. So many federal conservatives, including myself, were part of that coalition. But yeah, we saw things dramatically shift in 2024. And ultimately, I was actually even a candidate at the time with the BC Liberals / United. But ultimately, as we saw the kind of vote break out, we realized in that party, if we stay in this election, we're going to result in a vote split that is going to elect an NDP super majority. And that's not something I ever want to play a role in. So I played a role instead in standing that party down. Very, very difficult decision for a lot of people who've been involved in running as candidates and so on. But in putting our support behind the BC Conservatives in every way possible, getting out door knocking and so on, just to make sure that we deprived David Eby of an opportunity for a supermajority, which I think we successfully did.
Right, and with that bare majority that the NDP has, I mean, it's I guess theoretically 2 years until the next election. But what are you anticipating? What's the possibility that BC voters could go to the polls much sooner than that?
Yeah, it's anybody's guess. I think the only person who really knows probably is David Eby. There's a lot of speculation, though, and I think you're probably hearing some of the same things I am. The next scheduled election is 2028. Obviously, now we're in 2026, so it could happen anytime between now and then. I think David Eby is going to have to make a decision as to what he thinks the risks versus rewards of calling an early election would be. So we'll see, and I really don't know.
It's interesting too. I mean, following that election, and the Conservatives almost coming out of nowhere, coming close to government, and there was some splintering or some disagreement after the fact about where things stood, and eventually that led to John Rustad's resignation, and now this leadership race. What needs to be done within the BC Conservative Party, or sort of on the right or center right in BC, to once again kind of bring people together?
Yeah, and this is such a good question, and I think it's one that every leadership candidate needs to be thinking about. If we're not careful and we elect somebody who doesn't kind of bring the party together, we could end up in a splintered situation again, which is the last thing I want. So that's one of the goals I have in being in this, is to help try to bring the party together. But look, I think more broadly, just in terms of our appeal and who we're targeting with our message and so on, as a political party, I think there is a real opportunity for us to remind British Columbians that, Yeah, we're conservatives. We have conservative principles, but actually there's a lot of alignment between conservative principles and what I call kind of normal people or regular British Columbian principles. Just basic things like, do violent offenders belong in neighborhoods or do they belong in jail? Like people know the answer to that just inherently. Do we give people free drugs or do we try to get them well? People inherently intuitively know the answer to those kinds of questions. And even when it comes to some of the fiscal mess that we're in, the government's habit of just spending well beyond its means. Every family knows that, their household budget, you cannot do that. And so I do think there's such an opportunity for us to demonstrate to British Columbians that actually, instead of splintering, we can actually come together under a set of values that make sense to people.
And it's interesting because you wrote about this recently, what conservatism represents or your philosophy, because certainly there's a need, as you say, on the fiscal and economic side for a different approach. But conservatism can't be just relegated to those issues and everything else is sort of conceded to the other side. That as you see
Mhm.
it, conservatism involves speaking to cultural and societal issues.
I think it absolutely does. And I think there's a fear amongst a lot of conservatives, including some of my competitors in this race, that, we can stick to sort of fiscal matters or we can stick to deregulation or tax cuts and think that we've done our job. But the truth is, as I see it, the left or sometimes people call them progressives, have been aggressively pursuing a cultural agenda. And it really is a question for conservatives. Do we want to hold our end of the tug of war rope or not? Because if we don't, it's just going to go that way. And we see that in classrooms all the time, right? As a very easy example, we've got kids, our education system denigrating our history. We see people, tearing down statues. We see kids being told the land that they stand on isn't theirs. We see kids being taught it's actually in the curriculum guide, this idea that they need to develop mindsets of cultural humility. And I'm talking about like kindergartners. Like this, we can choose to just let that all slide and say we're not going to touch any of these sort of so-called cultural issues, or we can say actually we're proud of our history. We're all British Columbians. We're not settlers and uninvited guests. We're people who are here to in this province because we love it and we all call it home. We can say, that kids should be taught basically to succeed in literacy and mathematics and not be assaulted with all kinds of activist ideology that the NDP has been inserting into the education system. So, I mean, those are just a few examples, but I think if we don't fight those battles, we're losing the war.
Well, and you touched on this, and I mean, it does speak to the question of reconciliation. And look, I think there's some great opportunities to move forward with reconciliation. Part of what we're seeing in BC with LNG development, some of these projects is a good
Mhm.
example of that. But, at the same time, I know there's concern about the impact in BC of what's known as the DRIPA legislation, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Of course, there was that court
Mhm.
ruling recently that's raised all kinds of questions about what things look like moving forward with Indigenous land title claims with regard to private property. How does the BC government need to navigate all of that right now?
Yeah, I mean, look, like I think what the BC government under David Eby, the NDP government, has been doing is absolutely counterproductive. It's divisive. It is undemocratic. It is anti-prosperity. It is against any sense of common citizenship we may have. I mentioned this idea. Like we had an NDP MLA stand in the legislature and say, non-Indigenous British Columbians should be. I encourage them to call themselves settlers and uninvited guests. It's like to the British Columbians who were born here, who call this place home, to newcomers who we welcomed here, this idea of uninvited guests, like it's toxic to how people look at the issue. And I think what the unfortunate thing I think that is resulting from a lot of this, and there's way more to it than just what we call ourselves. There's these land use agreements and these consent-based slash veto agreements, as they are, in fact, around projects around the public interest, where we actually need to be pursuing these things, but we're placing decision making in the hands of these small governments that don't represent the broader public interest. These kinds of things altogether are creating, I think, a very toxic, divisive mindset. And my concern, and I've always tried to be very clear about this in the things I write and my commentary on this issue, because I've done a lot of it. I say, like, don't direct your frustration at Indigenous people. Like, please don't.
Right.
Direct it at the provincial government because they are the ones responsible for looking out for the broader public interest. And they are absolutely derelict in their duty in that regard. Indigenous groups, their job is to look out for their communities, and they're going to keep doing that. Of course, they're going to ask for stuff. That's their job. But it's the province's job to make sure that the public interest is represented.
What's the impact on the economic side as well? Does some of this uncertainty put a chill on investment? Is there the concern on that side?
I think there's a huge concern on that side. Like, I mean, even just going to the private property issue alone,
Mhm.
private property is the just that. the idea of clear title is foundational to the idea of investment in this province. But even quite aside from that, we've got a lot of public land use agreements that the government is entering into, particularly in what we call the Golden Triangle, which is a really mineral rich area of the province. I think it has something like 70% of Canada's copper reserves, just to give a sense. It's an area the size of England, like massive. They've entered
Yeah.
into consent based agreements with First Nations in the area where these mines cannot be permitted without the consent of First Nations. Well, you can imagine the kind of dynamic that creates for business who are trying to operate in these areas, where now they're entering into impact benefit agreements or other kinds of agreements where they have no leverage at all because they know that the decision is either yes or no. That will be made by that Indigenous group. So what we saw with a recent decision is, these, but again, like this is really troubling to me. You have these $10,000 payouts being made ahead of a community vote on whether the project proceeds. There's a reason why we've set up a regulatory process in this country and within our provinces where permitting and authorizations are made on the one hand, and any financial beneficiaries are well removed from those decisions on the other hand. And now we're in a situation where that's all mixed up, where you have people financially benefiting from decisions as to whether a project proceeds. Again, this isn't to blame the Indigenous groups. This is to blame a government that has created this environment where, if you're an investor, you're suddenly thinking, this is looking a little bit Banana Republic here. And I don't know if I want to be doing business.
Yeah. I'm here in Calgary. I know you were just recently in Calgary. I think in Alberta there's an eye on BC politics and that relationship between Alberta and BC and the possibility of what that can produce. But where there's been some tension lately, David Eby, I
Mhm.
think, has been at the center of some of that with some comments recently about the debate around Alberta's future, and of course making his opposition to a new pipeline, making that very being very vocal about that opposition. What do you make of how he's approached that relationship, and what would you bring to the table there?
Well, I think like every relationship, he approaches it in a way that is way more divisive than it needs to be. Look, like I look around this province as most British Columbians do, and you see like an abundance of natural resources. You see a skilled and ready workforce. You see a prime location relative to the rest of the world. You see, like there should be nothing standing in our way of being the most prosperous province and the most prosperous nation on earth. I really believe that. And Alberta is part of that too. And the fact that all this government knows how to do is throw up roadblocks saying, well, yes, but, or no way, this isn't happening. They're like, it's always, even when there is a yes, there's a big but that follows in terms of, all the reasons why we actually shouldn't do it. So I think that they're almost hostile to, I think, the national interest and the provincial interest in terms of getting those resources to market, creating the big paychecks for British Columbians, creating the jobs and so on. And I think it's very removed from what the public wants to see.
What can the federal government do to really unleash that potential? I mean, there's been a lot of talk and rhetoric and what could maybe come under the Build in Canada Act and the Major Projects Office, but what needs to be there, both in terms of what the BC government's going to step up and do, but also what we need to see from Ottawa right now?
Yeah, I think in BC, we need to actually be looking at some of these major projects that are clearly within the public interest and say, how do we actually get to a yes on this project instead of focusing on all the reasons why we say no? And I think the same thing goes for the federal government. I look at the federal government. I'm a longtime federal conservative, but I also know that this government, you can't as a Canadian want this government to fail at some of the things they're wanting to do because their success is Canada's success and so on. Like we need our governments to succeed. That's why I'm so frustrated in BC. So when Mark Carney says he wants to build a big project, that's in the national interest and the provincial interest, yes, I want him to succeed in doing that. My criticism is when he says, again, it's that yes, but we'll need the consent of the coastal First Nations. And that's something that David Eby has said. The coastal First Nations is not like a constitutionally ascribed Indigenous group. It is an NGO that is built to reject projects of this nature. We should not be placing the future of this country and this province into the hands of NGOs that are anti-development. It's not good for our prosperity. It's not good for us as Canadians and British Columbians.
You mentioned your involvement with the federal conservatives, and yet you were at the conservative convention. Just your takeaways from what you saw and heard, and what is the relationship, or what could be the relationship potentially between the BC Conservative Party and the federal Conservative Party?
Yeah, I think like at the end of the day, like we are a BC party. And so it
Mhm.
always has to be, BC first in terms of the message we're going to put forward and the things that we're advocating for. And there's going to be some things where there might be some disagreements federally and provincially. I think my job, if I'm successful in leading this party in this province, is going to be to welcome things that are in BC's interest, regardless of the party that's proposing them federally, and speak up for BC when those things aren't in our interest, and really be quite assertive in doing so. So I think there is like a natural probably relationship between the federal Conservative Party and the BC Conservative Party. I don't think it's been super. I don't think they've been super tied in or acting together in any meaningful way to date. I don't know if that'll change, but I guess we'll see.
All right. So we'll talk about next steps here. I guess May is the leadership race. So
Mhm.
what are your immediate sort of short and medium term priorities here going forward?
Yeah, so the actual vote is in May. You have to be a member to vote in this. It's actually one of the unique things about a within party leadership race is that as a party member you get to have a kind of outsized role in selecting the leader and the person who's going to be representing your interests in the province. So I always encourage people to sign up and become a member and actually get an opportunity to play that role. And that cutoff for signing up is mid-April. The votes in May. And then if I'm successful, it'll just be absolutely hitting the ground running in terms of speaking up for BC, forming a very, very strong opposition to David Eby's government and some of the things they're doing, but more importantly, setting ourselves up to succeed in the next election. And I think there is every opportunity to do that. We have such British Columbians, I think, are very, very tired of this government. They're desperate for some significant change. They're desperate for the courage to make the changes that are needed, and that's what I'm here to represent.
All right. Well, as I say, very fascinating time right now in BC politics. Your website,
Mhm.
it's winforbc.ca. Caroline
Mhm.
Elliot, thank you so much for joining us here this week.
Thank you for having me.